Hi everybody, this is my story of how I got into the Beatles. It's very much linked to my story of how I got into Paul McCartney. So I'm going to show you what albums, what books and what sort of situations led me to being a massive fan. So this is a response to a video that was done a couple of months ago by James Griffiths called How I Discovered Paul McCartney. Really good video. I'm going to put a link to that, one of his many great videos. I said at the time that I was going to do something similar, and here it is. So my story of how I got into the Beatles. So I kind of grew up in a house where there was always Beatles stuff around. So my mum and dad had sort of grown up and got together during the 1960s, and they'd bought a few records. They didn't have a massive Beatles collection, but what they had was in our house, and it was around me as we were growing up. And a few sort of key things that I remember in particular was the main one was an album called The Beatles Love Songs, and my dad had this on cassette in his car. So whenever I was in the car with my dad, he would often be playing this particular cassette, and I don't remember all of the songs being on it. I don't remember learning all of the songs at the time, but a few that I certainly remember hearing at that time was Yesterday, I'll Follow the Sun, Girl, In My Life, Words of Love, Here, There and Everywhere, And I Love Her, Michelle, This Boy, Norwegian Wood. Those were the kind of songs that were making an imprint on me, and I always sort of very much thought of these as being as an aside to what I was listening to on the radio. So for example, I was starting to listen to the top 40 on a Sunday tea time, which was always broadcast on a Sunday tea time on Radio 1, the whole of the top 40 as a countdown. I always thought of what I was listening to with my dad as being a completely separate thing to that. You know, that was his music, but I was liking it. And then I had my music that I was listening to on a Sunday on the radio. So I've never actually owned a copy of that album, strangely. There's a few of the key albums I'm going to talk about here that I've never owned a copy of, as weird as it sounds. And that's one of them. But I certainly remember listening to a lot of those songs there. And the next thing that happened, really, that I remember was John Lennon dying. And all I really knew at the time was that this is that guy who sings some of those songs on that tape that my dad's got in his car. That's all I could really link it to. But I mean, I remember on that morning, I remember being in the kitchen in our house, and I remember my mum, I don't think she was crying, but I remember her sort of stood against the kitchen worktop and sort of almost like holding on, and her head was bowed, and she was taking in the news on the radio, and I was sort of aware that this was big news, but I only really linked it to that cassette in my dad's car at the time. But the other thing that happened around then was that we bought a keyboard, you know, like a Bontempi Casio kind of keyboard. My mum liked to sort of play a few tunes on it, and I was sort of starting to just sort of play one finger stuff on it. And we had this book called Lennon and McCartney 50 Great Songs, and it was just, you know, I'd listened to my mum playing it, and she was a far better player than I was at that time. And I remember linking again to those songs that I'd been listening to with my dad in the car, and thinking that, oh, these are really great songs. And I've just started looking through the track list again now, and looking at the front cover of this book. I found it online, and it sort of strikes me now. There's so many songs on there that weren't even Lennon and McCartney songs. So things like Instant Karma and The Lovely Linda and such like that have made it into that book that just weren't even Lennon and McCartney songs. I paid no attention to those because I didn't know those songs, so there was no reason for me to want to sit and play them. And even looking at the cover photograph now, I can see, looking at it today, first time I've looked at it for probably 30 odd years, that's not an actual photograph. It's just a photo of Paul and a photo of John that they've cobbled together. They're from two quite different, years even. So I had that influence in the car. I had this keyboard book, and I started to, once I was old enough to spend any time alone in the house on my own, what I would often do is just go through my mum and dad's record collection. And they had a few Beatles albums. Not all of them, but they had the Red and the Blue albums, 62 to 66 and 67 to 70. Now again, to this day, they are two albums that I have never ever owned a copy of, strangely. But they were there, and I remember being absolutely fascinated by the fact that, you know what, those guys there on that Red album, they're the same blokes as on that Blue album. Really? Because obviously it's the same shot looking up the stairs at EMI. But I just couldn't wrap my head around that they were actually the same group of 4 people, and it absolutely fascinated me. So I'd often play some songs off the Red album, so I'd put things like Love Me Do and She Loves You on, and then I'd switch to the Blue album and there'd be things like Old Brown Shoe and just completely different songs. So it always fascinated me. Looking at the numbers on it, the fact that, well, that's what it goes from 1962 to 1970. That's the short time period we're looking at here. It always blew my mind. So as well as those 2 albums, the only other ones that they had were Help, Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper. Help, I always looked at the album cover. I loved the album cover. But I very, very rarely did I actually put that album on and listen to any of it. Rubber Soul I did a little bit, probably because there was a bit more of a link with that Love Songs album. I sort of knew some of the songs a bit more than I did with Help. But the one for me was Sgt. Pepper, so that was just looking at that cover. It was amazing to me. And looking at the back of it and seeing all those lyrics printed out and opening it up with that gatefold. And I'd put that album on and just listening to things like With a Little Help from My Friends, going into Lucy in the Sky and flipping it over and playing When I'm 64. Probably at the time I think I used to skip Within You Without You. I hadn't quite learned to appreciate that yet. But yeah, When I'm 64 and Lovely Rita. And then A Day in the Life at the end just sort of kind of blew my mind. So I was starting to get to know a few Beatles songs at that point. But still, I always regarded it as a very separate thing to my pop music as a teenager. That was very important to me at the time. There were 2 different things. It was almost like carrying on a secret affair with the Beatles when I wasn't listening to my own tapes of things. So it was quite an exciting time there. And around 1983, well, it would have been Christmas 1983, I got to hear what for me was my first new Paul McCartney song, and that was Pipes of Peace. So that got to number 1 in the UK charts around that time. And because I used to record the top 40, or just the songs from the top 40 as they were being played on radio, on BBC Radio 1, I recorded Pipes of Peace, and that's a tape that I would listen to hundreds and hundreds of times. And I always remember that at the end of the song, the DJ, I can't remember whether it was Tommy Vance or it might have been Simon Bates or somebody like that, saying, "Huddled away in a cabin somewhere, counting his money. Paul McCartney, Pipes of Peace." And that fascinated me as well, because I thought that that's what it actually was. Paul McCartney's now, he's that guy from those albums, but now he's just huddled away in a cabin, counting his money. I thought that's what he did. So that's what I kind of believed for a long time. And I remember asking my parents, well, what does Paul McCartney do now? As obviously he's written the song Pipes of Peace, but what sort of things does he do? And they said, oh yeah, he's a really famous songwriter now. He writes a lot of songs. And I kind of got the impression that, well, all those top 40 songs that I listen to, he must write those. Just absolute bizarre logic going on in my head. I was a very strange teenager. I'm probably still very strange now, to be honest. But I just then assumed that all the songs that are in the charts, Paul McCartney must sit in his cabin when he's not counting his money. He's writing these tunes that all these people put out as singles. Yeah, bizarre. So Pipes of Peace, got to love that song. And then the following year, Give My Regards to Broad Street came out. Now, I never had the album. I don't remember the song from the time. It's not one that I recorded when I was listening to the top 40. But what happened was I entered a newspaper competition, national newspaper called the Daily Express. And they had a competition to win the computer game. So I was a big fan of my ZX Spectrum 48K computer. Spent loads of my time playing games on that. And I entered this competition to win the computer game of Give My Regards to Broad Street. And I won! So I got this computer game through the post. And I'm going to show you some screenshots of this now. If you've never seen it, it's completely bonkers. So it kind of followed the plot of the film. But what would happen in this computer game is that different characters would go into tube stations in London, and you would get notified that, for example, this particular character, Ringo's got on a train at 11:33 at this particular tube station. What you had to do, you had to read the profile of Ringo, in this case, on the computer game, and guess where was he going to get off the tube. So it's about lunchtime. It tells me that this is his favourite restaurant, so I'm going to go to the nearest tube station to that restaurant and see if I can meet up with him as he gets off the tube. And you'd have to hope you'd got the right tube station. And if you did, you sort of got some points and you got a piece of the master tapes back that were lost, which is obviously the plot of the film. And what you had to do before midnight, you had to catch up with every character and meet them as they came out of a tube station. I never got remotely near to completing this game, but I spent ages looking at this. I learnt a lot about the geography of London from looking at the map that came with it, and it was just a great fun game that I spent a lot of time with. So that got Paul McCartney sort of a bit ingrained into my brain at that point. And the next thing that I remember Paul McCartney wise, let's put it this way, I have no memory of Press to Play whatsoever, no singles from it. They didn't get the play record buttons pressed down on the top 40, even though I was recording a lot of stuff from the top 40 at the time. Nothing from Press to Play. But I remember Spies Like Us coming out. What a way to try and get into Paul McCartney. But I remember that would have been, the back end of 1986. So that made it onto one of my top 40 tapes. So I'd listened to that song a lot. And it was then the next year when All the Best came out. So I heard that there was this compilation, Paul McCartney compilation album. And I think, so I didn't know anything about Wings' greatest hits. Didn't really know anything about Wings, to be honest. So for me, this was my first chance to get a compilation of what's this man done since he was in the Beatles. So I bought All the Best on cassette. And Once Upon a Long Ago was the single that came out, certainly in the UK anyway, that was on that album. And so I got to really love Once Upon a Long Ago. And I got to hear all these songs on All the Best that I'd never heard before. So there was only really Pipes of Peace and Once Upon a Long Ago. They were the only two songs that I knew on that album when I bought it. So I'd never heard Band on the Run, or Jet, or Live and Let Die, Maybe I'm Amazed, Mull of Kintyre. These were all coming up, these were all completely new songs to me. It was amazing. I spent so much time with that album for a lot of years. Absolutely devoured it. And that led me into being excited about the release of Flowers in the Dirt, which I've talked about on other videos. That was the first album that came out when I'd become a fan of Paul McCartney. So that really, from that point onwards, I'm a Paul McCartney fan. I'm not going to talk about that kind of things. Let's go back to the Beatles. So yeah, I'd play those albums of my mum and dad's, which wasn't a great selection, but it was enough to sort of catch my eye, if you like, catch my ear. 1987, the 20th anniversary of Sergeant Pepper. So there was a documentary, there was a few documentaries, quite a few TV programmes, but the one that really sort of stood out to me as the one, oh, I want to watch that, I'm going to watch that when it's on, was one called It Was 20 Years Ago Today. So I watched that, and it was the first time that I'd ever probably seen George Harrison speak. Certainly I didn't know George Martin was until this point, so seeing him talk about the album, seeing George talk about the album, this was all completely new to me. As I've said, I was starting to get into Paul McCartney, so it was really interesting to see him speak, because I'd heard a few songs. I'd never really heard him talk at all. So this was fascinating to me in 1987, and I'd really sort of say 1987, that time, 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper, was a big thing for me that started me actually wanting to learn more about the Beatles. And I got hold of video cassette, VHS cassette of the documentary The Complete Beatles, which I'm sure many of you will know. Absolutely fantastic documentary. And you can't get it now. I mean, I think you can, if you're lucky, you'll find it on YouTube now and again. My understanding is that Paul McCartney has bought the rights to it to take it out of circulation so that it's not out there anywhere. I think he didn't want it competing with the anthology. But so anyway, I watched The Complete Beatles all the time. If it was school holidays and I was in on my own, I'd watch the complete Beatles if I wasn't watching Superman or Star Wars or something like that. The complete Beatles is where I went to, and it absolutely hooked me. So from that point, around sort of 87, 88, 89, that was me getting into the Beatles. And the other thing that had a massive effect on me with the Beatles was in late 1989, I went to Germany for a week. Went with my friend. His brother was on an RAF base, Royal Air Force base over in Germany, RAF Bruggen. I'd never heard a CD before in my life at this point. I knew they existed, but I assumed that they played video as well. That was a surprise to me that they didn't. But anyway, my friend's brother, whose house we stayed at, he had the White Album on CD. I'd never heard it before. I think I probably knew Back in the USSR. I'd heard that. But other than that, it was completely new to me. And wow, it absolutely blew my mind. So songs like Blackbird and Piggies, Wild Honey Pie, Revolution 9. Oh my goodness, this was like nothing I'd heard before of the Beatles, because obviously it's quite different to Sgt. Pepper and certainly Help and Rubber Soul, that were my other two reference points. And what was on the Red and Blue albums, well, the Blue album, sort of little bits of it might have hinted at it, but it was just completely different. And that really, really grabbed me in. So from that point, I wanted to hear Abbey Road. I wanted to hear Let It Be, Magical Mystery Tour. You know, if the White Album is going to be like that, what's all this other stuff going to be like? So the White Album, at that point, my introduction in 1989 was massively influential for me. When I got my first CD player in early 1990, I then started buying up all the albums on CD. This would be the 1987 CDs, which I've still got up there, up in the corner of my room. I think you can probably, yes, I think you can see those on there. And from that point onwards, I became obsessed with the Beatles. And my story just sort of went on from there, really, and Anthology was just sort of one of the greatest things that ever happened in my life. Outside of family, of course, Anthology just blew my mind. But yeah, anyway, that was the lead up to all that was really sort of during the early, mid, late 1980s is when I started getting into all this, and it's just carried on from there, really. So yeah, that's my story. I'd love to hear some anecdotes of yours about how you got into the Beatles or McCartney or Lennon or anybody like that. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye bye.